As a reminder, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Tuesday morning that the latest developments prove that rumors of the death of NATO's unity were greatly exaggerated. But the hardest is certainly yet to come, though both the U.S. and Germany have already expressed reluctance. Volodymyr Zelensky will be traveling to the Lithuanian capital, where he's expected to make the case that Ukraine has earned the right to join NATO once the war is over. Take a listen to what he had to say.
When we applied for membership of NATO, we spoke frankly. De facto, Ukraine is already in the alliance. Our weapons are the weapons of the alliance. Our values are what the alliance believes in, and our defense is precisely the element of the European formula that makes it united, free, and at peace.
Now, the U.S. National Security Advisor also said this Tuesday morning that NATO will be laying out a path of reforms for Ukraine to eventually join, though it will not provide a timetable. On this, we're going to cross now to Terry Schultz, who's a correspondent for France 24 in Vilnius. Hi there, Terry. So are these words from Sullivan then any more encouraging for Ukraine?
They really aren't. This is, in fact, what NATO has been saying all along as a whole, as an alliance. And, in fact, his mention of the reforms that Ukraine would need to do may even bring really some disappointment on Ukraine's part, because it would like to very much fast-track its membership. Now, remember that Ukraine wanted to become a NATO member even before the war, and it had a lot of reforms on its path. It had anti-corruption reforms. It had some governance reforms. And so for Jake Sullivan to bring that up again is really not going to enlighten Ukraine's mood as it heads into this summit. What it says, and you heard Volodymyr Zelensky say this, is that, in fact, we are fighting NATO's war right now. The reason that Russia can't get to you is because it would have to go through us there in Ukraine. So Zelensky would very much like NATO to make a leap of faith and say it will bring Ukraine into the alliance sooner rather than later. As it stands now, no NATO member is going to be able to agree to bring in a member with an active conflict on its territory. So what Zelensky is going to look for is a promise that as soon as that war is over, Ukraine will be let in.
Terry, I want to keep you with us for a second, but before I turn to another question, I want to get a reaction from our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, because Vladimir Putin is also obviously watching all of these developments very closely.
Yes, he is. Look, Vladimir Putin, it's the biggest open secret. He relishes anything that smacks of disarray or disunity or division within the NATO ranks. Obviously, this latest about face and Sweden potentially about to enter the alliance is a blow. It's a blow to the jugular of Putin. What has Putin's overarching sort of approach and attitude been? It has been that NATO is to blame for the war against Ukraine, not the 200,000 plus Russian troops that had been massed along Belarus's border, that invaded Ukraine last February 2022, that then attacked across the country, civilians, airports, roads, infrastructure, so on and so forth, as a lot of people point out. That's not to blame. It is NATO and NATO's aggressive posture, a NATO that is hell-bent on humiliating Russia, on attacking Russia, on posing a threat, an existential threat to Russia's national security. That's why this war is happening. Now, Putin believes, and he honestly believes this is sort of his worldview, that NATO is hopelessly divided and weak and decadent, like the rest of the West. He believes that he can outlast the resolve of NATO, articulated time and again by Jens Stoltenberg and other leaders of other allied members, that as long as it takes, in quotes, they will stand by Ukraine. Putin doesn't believe what NATO says as far as it can throw NATO. It believes that at some point, if he can just ride out the clock long enough, the public opinion will weary of Ukraine, will turn against Ukraine. The leaders, especially leaders in populist countries where you have a lot of far-right movements rising, who are also perhaps souring slowly on the war in Ukraine, it will all go pear-shaped, as they say. And that resolve will weaken. There will be fissures, cracks in the edifice of NATO unity. NATO wants to show the lie to that NATO-bashing narrative that Putin has hoisted, if you will, upon tens of millions of Russians. It is the narrative that is repeated time and again in the weaponized, state-run, propagandistic media. So this is what Putin's hoping for. Disarray and division. Will he get it? NATO hopes to show him the lie.
Well, let's turn back to Terry Schultz then. Terry, so we've heard both of you say that Ukraine is unlikely to get the timeline that it wants, but NATO does remain united. So what can we expect to see Kyiv get out of this summit?
What Volodymyr Zelensky would very much like and will not get are guarantees that NATO will come to the defense of Ukraine. Of course, that's Article 5. That's part of being a NATO member, which they are not going to be able to achieve at this summit. And so what we're likely to see are what the allies call security assurances or security pledges. And this is going to be a long-term, multi-annual commitment that Ukraine will get all the weapons that the allies can provide, that they will get training, that increasingly NATO's armed forces will be interoperable with NATO's, so that when they get that eventual membership bid, they will be ready to go and fight as an ally immediately. And so right now you've got what's called the Quad, the US, the UK, France, and Germany working on, the US, the UK, France, and Germany working on creating this framework so that NATO allies and possibly even the G7 can commit to these assurances for Ukraine. So that's going to be very important. But we should also remind our viewers of another thing, and that is what's often called the Zelensky effect. Volodymyr Zelensky walks into a meeting being told he won't get something. He walks out with things like tanks, which he told he was never going to get, heading his way. So you can never be sure until the summit wraps up.
Terry Schultz in Vilnius and Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator, thank you very much to both of you for that.